What is the purpose of an assignment? As part of an ongoing series in Bennington's magazine, we speak with faculty members about homework assignments, what they inspire, and the motivations behind them. For this issue, we talk with well-known psychologist, author, and faculty member David Anderegg.
The major reason I give assignments is to make sure that people are integrating on a deep level the concepts we're talking about, right? It's really easy to learn concepts superficially. I mean, it's easy for some people, not so easy for others, but it's easy to sort of get familiar with the terminology and be able to understand the terminology, et cetera, but to really understand, take into your conceptual framework, to really understand it, right? To really know what I'm talking about and to be able to articulate it to yourself. And to be able to articulate it in writing is the easiest way for me to see whether or not people are there. And I tell them, for example, in developmental psychology, that they wouldn't be wrong if they said, the point of this class is that children think differently from adults. Okay, that's correct. That's the gist of it. and then we could just all go home. I could say, okay, children think differently from adults. You got that? And they could say, yep, okay, and go home. And that's not what I'm looking for. I'm looking for being able to grasp a concept, be able to understand it specifically, to be able to understand its range and limits, and being able to apply it to a real world situation and be able to understand what it means and what it doesn't mean. Yeah, what the assignment was presumably, if scientists are correct, they're going to find the, quote, genetic bases for more and more mental health diagnoses, right? And if they do, then the assignment I gave my students was to assume sometime in the future when these genetic bases have been identified. And so you can do a test of a fetus and you can know, not with 100% probability, but a high probability that this child is going to have a particular diagnosis. So then you have to decide whether or not you want to keep that child around in this world, knowing with a fairly high probability that they're going to have a particular mental health diagnosis. So on the one hand, this is all still part of the assignment. On the one hand, there are the arguments about the necessity of behavioral diversity and how unethical it is to get rid of people. And so I had them read, Andrew Sullivan wrote a piece about 8 years ago, I think it was, about the gay genocide, about this, about people who were looking for genesis of homosexuality on a genetic and neurochemical level. And they were doing experiments with sheep and discovering that actually you could manipulate the sexual preferences of sheep, and it could be done. At some point, be able to do a genetic test on a fetus and say, okay, this child is, with a certain degree of certainty, is going to be homosexual. And Sullivan, as a very politically active gay man, was saying, this will lead to massive abortions of gay fetuses. And I'm not sure this is where we want to go. On the other side, there was an argument, it was set forth in the New York Times, about where parents had been sued by their children for not aborting them because they were born with predictable genetic defects, and they were born because their parents didn't believe in abortion, and they were miserable, and so they sued their parents for wrongful birth. It's not wrongful death, it's wrongful birth. You should have been able to know this life of suffering was predictable and you didn't do anything about it, right? So I laid that out for my students, both the gay genocide argument and the wrongful birth argument, which are both pieces in the news. They're just newspaper articles. And the metaphor for the whole class was behavioral diversity is like any kind of biodiversity. That any kind of biodiversity is good. That monocultures, like, you know, where all you plant are elm trees because you like the shade, are never a good idea, because then when all the elm trees dies of Dutch elm disease, you have no trees, right? So in biology, everybody knows that monocultures are not a good idea. So there's a metaphor for the entire course, which is behavioral diversity a good idea? And if we consider various kinds of mental illness as behavioral diversity, if we could get rid of them, should we? I'm not talking about treating them, I'm talking about getting rid of them. So they had to think about that. And I gave them some examples. Attention deficit disorder, autism, bipolar disorder. People with bipolar disorder suffer greatly. The suicide rate is higher than any other mental illness. Really? Yeah, it's terrible. It's a terrible disease. So my question was, in the future, if we get to the point where we can do a genetic analysis of a fetus and know this child is very likely going to have bipolar disorder, should we get rid of it? I do think that there's some big moral questions coming down the pike, which we are just at the beginning of. And I actually do think my students need to be prepared for living in a world where you can make these kinds of choices. And I want them to think about it, not just because I want them to acquire concepts, but many of them are going to be parents. There are all sorts of parents in America now, if they have children, if they come from a short family, or if they have a child who's kind of on the short side, they go to doctors and they want them to give them human growth hormone so they're not so short in the interest of their lifetime earnings and future potential, that they get an injection so they end up to be 5'7" instead of 5'3". And I want my students to think about that. Think about, okay, is that what you would do? Would you do that? And with mental disorders, people are always trying to figure out what is the adaptive correlate to a mental disorder. There's pretty good research now, thanks to Kay Redfield Jamison, who's is a big researcher at NIMH, and she's bipolar. She's written a bunch of books about it, which demonstrates that in fact the people who have bipolar disorder, or even people who have a family history of bipolar disorder, are really more creative than other people. That's not just a myth. It seems to be more like a fact now. And so if we could eradicate all those bipolar people, we would also be eradicating a huge population of people who are really creative, because their thinking is always going like this. It's divergent. It's always like, what about this? What about this? I mean, that's kind of like what it's like to be manic, right? But sometimes people who are, even when they're not manic, their thinking is very divergent. And so it's an interesting way to think about behavioral diversity. Like, even if there's a fair amount of suffering that goes along with it, what are the adaptive benefits? I tried to make both sides of the argument. Bennington students very rarely say, yeah, diversity, people who are different, let's snuff them out. There weren't too many people who took me up on the making the case for wrongful birth. But I do have to tell you, this was an in-class assignment about valuing diversity, so to speak. I haven't done this lately because it's too upsetting, but I used to ask all of my students to confidentially, without a whole lot of introduction, because I don't want to tip my hand, I say, in the future, genetic manipulation is going to be more and more possible. So let's say that there is a time in the future, which will probably happen during your lifetime, during your childbearing years, when you can choose the eye color of your child. What eye color would you choose? And that's all I say. Write it down anonymously and hand it in. Over the years that I did that, I only got one person saying brown. And there were hundreds of students who said blue. Hundreds. Every single person said, if I could guarantee my child's eye color, I would guarantee that they had blue eyes. Every single student. There's some big moral questions coming down the pike, which we are just at the beginning of. And I actually do think my students need to be prepared for living in a world where you can make these kinds of choices. And I want them to think about it, not just because I want them to acquire concepts, but many of them are going to be parents. What are they going to do?
This has been a conversation with Bennington psychology faculty member David Anderegg. To read more about David, check out the winter 2015 issue of the Bennington magazine. And also thanks to Bennington student Webb Crawford for providing the music bed under this piece.